Hi and welcome. This is Notable, and today we're continuing our discussion of the theme of religion and conflict in the poetry of John Donne. Now, in part 1, we had so much crucial context to cover that we only had time to analyse the one poem, which was Holy Sonnet IX of Poisonous Minerals. So to balance this out, this video will be a bit of an analysis spree. We're going to look at two poems in detail. We'll start with Holy Sonnet V, I Am a Little World, and we'll conclude with Holy Sonnet XVII, Since She Whom I Loved. So without further ado, let's take a look at I Am a Little World. Now, in the video on the theme of love and sex in Donne's work, we discussed the motif of the microcosm in his love poetry. This motif reappears here, though obviously not in the context of romantic love. Donne refers to himself as a little world, and this little world is made up of both physical components, which Donne refers to as elements, and spiritual components, which he calls angelic sprite. So the idea he's trying to communicate here is that he, his being, which is made up of both his body and soul, is a little world. Donne then moves on to argue that his little world has been shrouded by the darkness of black sin. So he's using the metaphor of a little world darkened by an endless night to describe his relationship with sin. He sees his sins as something which shroud him in darkness. In addition, by using imagery of darkness and night to describe sin, Donne also implies that sin is blinding. It shrouds a person in darkness and prevents them from seeing God. Notice the plosive alliteration in the line, "but black sin hath betrayed." We have the repetition and alliteration of those harsh B sounds. Consonance is the term for the alliteration of consonants, and here we have a kind of jarring consonance. The repetition of these harsh sounds creates an abrasive tone, which perhaps mirrors the violent, mutilating effect of sin on his being or little world. From this, Donne concludes that, as his little world has been so corrupted and darkened by sin, it must be destroyed. He writes that both parts must die, and the parts he's referring to here are his body and soul, the elements and the angelic sprite. The next sentence begins with the pronoun you, which alerts us to the fact that God is being apostrophised in the poem. Donne does often speak directly to God in his holy sonnets, and as we can see, he's doing that here too. He praises God for his strength and power. He writes, "You which beyond that heaven which was most high have found new spheres and of new lands can write." So we might refer to this as God's omnipotence, his all-powerful nature. Donne goes on to ask God to purify his little world with water. He beseeches him to drown him by pouring new seas into his eyes and forcing him to weep earnestly. Donne hopes that this weeping will wash his little world, which remember is a metaphor for himself, of its sin. Essentially, he's asking God to purify him with water. However, after this, we immediately have a volta, which is indicated by the use of the word but. Now, we discussed this last time, but a volta is a turning point in a sonnet, which traditionally occurs on the 9th line. In this poem, however, it takes place on the 10th line, which is unusual. Now, you can read into this as you wish, and your reading may be vastly different from mine, but for me, this delay signals Donne's desperation. It's as if he's indulging himself in the belief that his sins can be drowned with water for as long as possible. Colloquially, we might say that he's clinging on to the idea, though you shouldn't really be this informal in your essays. Ultimately, however, the volta does eventually come, and Donne is forced to confront the idea that he can't be purified peacefully with water, as he had hoped. Instead, he can only be purified with fire. He concedes that it must be burnt. So, as we mentioned, he's accepting that his sins cannot be washed away with water, as he'd previously hoped, and that they must instead be burnt away with fire. He argues that his sins, such as his lust and envy, have already burnt in his little world, making it fouler, and therefore he's going to force the flames of sin to retire, and in their place beg God to burn his world with purifying flames. You'll notice that he writes that the flames doth in eating heal, by which he means that, in burning him, they're cleaning him of his sins and therefore healing him. You'll see that the poem ends with a rhyming couplet, zeal and heal, which provides us with a resounding sense of finality, perhaps suggesting that Donne has reconciled himself to the idea that his world must be burnt. Now, interestingly, the idea that sins must be defeated through pain is a chiefly Catholic notion. You've probably heard of Catholic monks wearing painful hair shirts, for example, or engaging in self-flagellation, which is the act of flogging oneself. So Donne's request to be burnt in order to be redeemed is, just like in If Poisonous Minerals, perhaps evidence of his confused faith and his conflicted allegiances, as at this time he'd converted to being a Protestant. Donne's turmoil and anguish is captured in the poem by his frequent emotive expressions, such as "Oh" and "Oh Lord," and this sense of desperation is heightened by the many imperative verbs, such as pour, drown, and burn, because they show Donne begging God to take action and help him. So ultimately, this is a great poem to compare to If Poisonous Minerals, as both poems contain allusions to doctrine which is chiefly Catholic. Both poems show Donne struggling with the idea that his being has been polluted with sin, and both poems conclude with Donne begging God for mercy and the cleansing of these sins. So the second poem that we're going to look at today is Holy Sonnet XVII, Since She Whom I Loved, which is a very different kind of sonnet to the ones we've discussed previously. The she who Donne is referring to is his wife, Anne More. In 1617, Anne was pregnant for the 12th time, and she died a few days after giving birth to a stillborn child. Donne was stricken with grief, and he never remarried. In this sonnet, Donne attempts to come to terms with his loss. It's a poem which is struggling to grapple with contrary feelings, however. On the one hand, Donne wants to have faith in God's greater wisdom and accept Anne's death. He wants to believe that his wife has left her life on earth for a greater existence in heaven, and that her death is a part of God's divine plan. On the other hand, he's struggling under the weight of his grief, and he expresses resentment towards God for taking Anne from him. What's interesting about this poem is that Donne's resentment appears to take the better of him, quashing his other feelings. In this sense, it's like the inverse of the poem we discussed in part 1, If Poisonous Minerals. In If Poisonous Minerals, Donne begins with resentment and frustration, but ends with acceptance. Here, Donne tries to embrace acceptance, but he finds his resentment and his grief to be too strong a force to subdue. This is just my reading of the poem, and you may unearth a different meaning in it. As we can see, Donne begins the poem with Anne's death. He uses the metaphor of death as a debt to be paid to capture this. Donne then writes that her soul early into heaven ravished. Now, the word early here is really interesting. It is indeed true that Anne died early. She was only 33 years old. But by pointing this out in the poem, Donne seems to be expressing doubt in God's decision to take Anne from him. He's telling God that her death was too soon, and in doing so he's challenging the idea, perhaps, that God has an ultimate plan. Also notice Donne's use of the verb ravished here, which has sexual connotations. Later in the poem, Donne will depict God as a jealous lover, and this verb ravish contributes towards this idea. Now that Anne is dead, Donne claims that holy and heavenly things my mind is set, by which he means that he can focus entirely on his faith and his devotion to God, because all other purposes in his life have been removed. He uses the metaphor of thirst to describe this yearning for God. He desired God, and now that Anne's dead, his thirst has fed, because he's devoted himself entirely to God. However, he quickly moves on to undermine this by claiming that a holy, thirsty dropsy melts me yet. By this, he means that though his yearning for God, or his thirst, has been satisfied, he still feels unsatisfied. Now, please don't let the many adjectives throw you off here. Donne is simply claiming that his yearning for God is holy, because for Christians it's ultimately a good thing to desire God, and it's thirsty, because Donne never feels satisfied. Finally, it's diseased, which is what Donne means by the word dropsy, because he doesn't feel satisfied even when his desires are met. A good way to understand this is to think of Donne's yearning for God as a literal thirst for water. Every time Donne drinks a glass of water, emptying the glass, he continues to feel thirsty. Now, if someone always felt thirsty, no matter how much water they drank, you'd probably conclude that they're sick or unwell in some way. And this is what Donne means by dropsy. His yearning for God is diseased, because he doesn't feel satisfied even when his desires are met. Now, on the 9th line of the poem, we have a volta. This volta signals a change in tone. It's the point at which Donne's resentment towards God seems to take over. He describes God as a jealous lover who's attempting to woo Donne's soul. God appears to feel threatened by Anne, and he's anxious that Donne will devote himself to the pursuits of the world, the flesh, and the devil, instead of devoting himself to saints and angels, things divine. As a result, God takes Anne from him. So, like I'm a Little World and If Poisonous Minerals, this poem documents an internal struggle, an inner conflict, but unlike the other poems, it concludes with bitterness and resentment towards God. Now, next time we'll be analysing Donne's relationship with his creator in even more depth, but for now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.